So we want to welcome back Dr. Harrison Schmitt for being a major supporter of HGS, GCAGS, and AAPG, of which he's an honorary member, and there is the Harrison H. Schmitt Award from AAPG. We want to thank Dr. Schmitt for leading another Space Center field trip, which many of us had the opportunity to go on Saturday, and it was spectacular. Dr. Schmitt has a PhD in geology from Harvard University and a BS from Caltech. Dr. Schmitt was elected U.S. Senator from New Mexico, 1977 to 1983. And Dr. Schmitt, get this, is the only geologist thus far to walk on the moon in the Apollo 17 mission in 1972. We just celebrated in December the 50th anniversary. Dr. Schmitt continues to research planetary geoscience and future energy. And befitting a true geologist, Dr. Schmitt and Apollo 17 collected more rocks than any other Apollo mission. 741 rock, and importantly, soil samples totaling 110.5 kilograms, and get this, including a deep core from 3 meters below the lunar surface. How cool is that? Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Harrison Schmitt to the stage.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, and congratulations on another successful conference. It's just remarkable what you all have done and what you do down here in Houston in these kinds of venues. And of course, Charles didn't do it, Linda did it. You know, on a brief, serious note, the energy and space challenges that we face, America faces today, really are comparable, if not greater, than the 1960s. It's still the old question of freedom versus tyranny, and the space program plays an extraordinarily important role in that. It probably really was one of the primary catalysts that brought down the Soviet Union. The success that we had in the 1960s and 70s was unquestionably discouraging to the leadership of that unfortunate nation. Now, on the positive side, there's no question in my mind that we have the young men and women today comparable to those of the 60s and 70s that are going to meet this challenge, and one of them is with us today. To be But the science of the moon continues to move forward. As so many of my colleagues have said, the Apollo samples are the gift that keeps on giving. And we're going to add to that collection very shortly. In fact, some of you may be aware that as we are here today, the Apollo 17 samples are continuing to be worked on, ones that were kept frozen for 50 years, with the understanding back 50 years ago that new technologies would be available today that were not available then, and these samples, primarily a drive tube core, but others from Station 3 in the avalanche that came off the side of the South Massif, that drive tube is being really investigated to the nth degree. It's the so-called Angshka group, the Apollo New, let's see, what is that acronym? Apollo New Generations Sample Analysis. I normally don't have to say that. Also, the synthesis of all that has been done in the last 50 years continues, primarily in my office. And because it's very difficult to get grants for synthesis. The grant makers in the federal government, which unfortunately are controlling most of the academic research today, really want very specific projects that have a very narrow result. and synthesis is discouraged, unfortunately. But we are, as a consequence of what's going on with me and some of my colleagues, we are continuing to understand more deeply all the time the evolution of the moon and its relationship to the Earth, to the history of the sun. That is fairly new, and it is primarily coming out of that core that Charles mentioned. One of the things we have found is that about 500 million years ago, and keep that date in mind, we're trying to pin it down a little more precisely, but 500 million years ago, the energy of the sun increased by over a factor of 2. The energy that the sun was distributing as part of the solar wind, that is. And also, we are increasingly beginning to understand the context of the resources that are on the moon, particularly that resource that I've spoken to AAPG about too many times probably, light isotope of helium called helium-3. That is a wonderful aneutronic fuel for fusion power and has a number of other applications today, and if it were available on Earth in quantity, those applications would be leading to all sorts of new things. Quantum computing needs very low temperature refrigerants, and also helium-3, because it can be polarized, makes it possible to get extremely high resolution lung images. And if you can have early diagnosis of lung cancer or COPD, then you have the opportunity, unbelievable opportunity to survive. Today, only about 19%, 20% of people who are diagnosed with lung cancer survive. If you can get early diagnosis, that jumps up to about 90%. We do have the data for that. So that's, that helium-3 is something that we're going to continue to try to get back to Earth. My colleagues and I are working very hard to make the business case that actually can take place. So with us today are one of the astronauts that's going to be introduced shortly, that is going to add to our collection, add to our knowledge, and if I may say so, add to the fame of Caltech. We both had the opportunity to be at that remarkable institution at different times, of course, and we were really very proud of it, and proud of what now this person yet to be introduced. That sort of sounds like A.K. Rowling stuff. That she will contribute greatly to our future knowledge. So thank you very much, and I think Jeff Lund is going to be the next on stage. I believe the question had to do specifically with Starlink.
Yes, sir.
I am not an expert or even very familiar with Starlink, other than there are a lot of satellites involved. But I suspect that the percentage of the objects in space that Starlink represents is very small, primarily because some of our some other nations have exploded satellites in orbit, and that has created a great deal of debris. Still, space is very large. It's a very rare event when space debris is encountered. I guess NORAD's primarily responsible for tracking it, and when something seems to be threatening the space station, they just adjust the orbit. So we can do that for a while, but at some point we need to have a business case, or at least a national security case, made for beginning to deplete those objects in space that are no longer useful.
Need a minesweeper.
I tell you, I'm finding age is a minesweeper. It'll be quite a while before you don't have to be extraordinarily physically fit to work in space. Once you're even on the moon in 1/6 gravity, once you're in a suit, and the XEMU is going to be heavier than the A70B that I wore, you're going to need physical strength, and particularly you need strength in your forearms, because the gloves are still pressure gloves, as I understand it. It's sometimes a little hard to get all the specifications of the new XEMU. That's an extravehicular mobility unit, for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the acronyms. And so being physically fit, as Jessica is, and all the astronauts have to be, is extraordinarily important. So you combine that with intellect and experience, and that's really the primary criteria that, fortunately, I think NASA is still using. And if you're looking at astronauts who are professional pilots, it's the same thing. It's experience, it's physical fitness, and their educational, intellectual attributes. So now, having said that, my father-in-law, late father-in-law, was a victim of MS, and we had a great conversation once about that weightlessness removes that handicap. And so someday, I keep telling people for the last several decades, someday we're going to recognize that for some purposes, you don't need to have quite the level of criteria for working in space as we currently. The unique aspect beyond that of the moon is the exposure to dust. About 1% of the lunar regolith or soil is less than a micron in size. And normally here on Earth, we haven't been exposed to less than micron evolution in our tolerance for dust. And so even though with the Apollo experience, there has been no obvious problem from being exposed to that dust, and I breathed it 4 times in the course of my time on the moon. Nevertheless, it is something that our terrestrial experience really tells us we don't want to have chronic exposure to. And that is a major design constraint on the spacecraft that go to the moon, and should be. Now, also, I must say, NASA's has had appropriately what they call a longitudinal study that the Apollo astronauts, at least, have participated in on a voluntary basis. Most of them have. That study, though, on a scientific basis, probably was not really designed to find out some of the issues that one would like to find out based on that Apollo experience. And now it's too late to find out some of those things. But nevertheless, that will be a significant constraint in the design of spacecraft, and is. And I've participated as a consultant for some of the spacecraft designers just on that very specific and narrow issue. So just keep that in mind. Dust is something that miners know that you've got to worry. I have a feeling my father contracted COPD by going in right after the dynamite blast to map the face of a tunnel. And it is an issue, and we must take it take it very seriously.
You said it screws up duct tape too.
Oh, yeah. When we had a roll of duct tape on Apollo 17, and all the missions did. It was in our toolkit, and it was always very useful. It helped us repair a fender and the like. But the one thing that everybody who's dealt with duct tape knows, you can't get it dusty. It just doesn't work very well. And in the lunar environment, that is a challenge, believe me. Based on the information we have now, and the question will be part of my answer, the moon's reduced gravity, 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, is actually a major advantage. Human beings adapt, as near as I could tell, adapt very quickly. By the time we went out the spacecraft for our first excursion, first work, extravehicular activity, I felt like I'd already adapted. And there was a little bit of getting used to where your center of gravity is, because the backpack moves your center of gravity about 2 inches behind you, or behind the normal place. And so if you ever wonder why in the TV footage the astronauts are leaning forward, is to get that center of gravity up over your feet again. And so probably in the first hour or so there was some stumbling, because just getting the brain used to realizing where that center of gravity had to be. But overall, except for the gloves, except for the forearms, you don't wear your muscles out very much. And even Even in the case of the forearms, after a good night's sleep, there is no residual soreness. Even though you know they're fatigued, you've got to slow down, you've got to take things easy, otherwise you'll overdo it and get too fatigued in those forearm muscles. The nice thing is that the circulation system is so efficient, this is my opinion now, as a vastly experienced medical doctor, that the circulation system is so efficient that the lactic acid never has a chance to damage muscle tissue. And so you have no soreness. So I would say overall, 1/6 gravity is great. And if we ever figure out how to provide gloves with some assist in them, and we should be able to do that in this day and age, but it hasn't been done yet, then the forearm issue will go away. Now, it did go away with those like Jim Riley, who unfortunately is not with us today and planned to be, but who constructed the space station. They were much better prepared than we were in terms of the endurance and strength of those forearm muscles. They had special trainers, experts on how to train specific muscle groups, and that's very, very important, and I hope that that's going to continue, and is continuing. We did not do that. We knew we needed to be in shape, but we didn't have that for Apollo. We did not train that way, and so we had much more of an issue than I think Jessica and others will have when they start working in these new suits.
So we have time for one more question, and if somebody's got a really burning question, we'll take it. But I want to give the...
There's one behind the
Yes,
post.
I want to give both Dr. Schmidt and Dr. Watkins a chance to make final comments. So we'll take one more question. So who's the fellow right there? That's you? Yep. Please speak loudly.
This is a question about the past for Jack.
Two or three things. One, on the training side of things, what happened to really, I think, catalyze the training that the Apollo astronauts have, and I think is extending into the Artemis generation, is that once I had completed pilot training, I began to discuss with Alan Shepard, who was my boss at the time, that the astronaut office should take much more responsibility for its scientific training than it had. It really had not. It had left that to others outside of the office. And he agreed to the point that he said, well, if you can convince Jim Lovell, who was the commander of Apollo 13, that we should go into a much more simulation-based training program on real geology, though. Simulation-based, all the tools, time constraints, things like that, no suit, but everything else would be the same, and then go ahead. And so I convinced Jim Lovell, and he took it on really with a vengeance. He really enjoyed the geology, and so Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes and their backup crew, who turned out to be John Young and Charlie Duke, who flew Apollo 16, got exposed to a really intense training program. Well, Jim and Fred did not have a chance to use that training because of the accident on Apollo 13, but they convinced the Apollo 15 crew, Dave Scott in particular, that they should continue that kind of training. So that through a combination of people and events, that began to mature a very intensive training program, which resulted in having about a week a month in the field for all the so-called J mission crews. The last 3 missions had about a week a month in the field doing that kind of training. So hopefully that will be fully transferred ultimately to Artemis 3 and subsequent. Now, I spent a day last May in a evaluation of the plans for the Artemis geology tools. And it turns out that I agreed with them, that the Apollo 17 suite of tools is a pretty damn good suite of tools. And so that's, unless things have changed, that's basically where they're headed. With one major exception, we had a very difficult time with connectors. Again, it's the dust issue. The silicate dust got into those connectors, and they were aluminum, all aluminum, and aluminum is softer than silicate dust. And the current people finally figured out why those connectors froze up. And so they're putting steel covers or sheaths inside the connectors because the steel will break up the particles. So that's a really important innovation for the tools. I think that the suite of tools they'll have, if they stick with it, are going to work out extremely well. The one thing that it'll be a while before they get to do is coring. We all love coring, don't we? And it is extremely important for turning the regolith into a history book of the solar system. And we have one 3-meter core. We have a couple cores from Apollo 15 and 16, which are shorter and partially incomplete. But we need more of that, and particularly when you get cores in the higher latitudes. I think that's going to be very, very important. So that development has not proceeded. I think it may be delayed to be part of the new rover, the so-called lunar terrain vehicle, because one of the things you want to do with coring in the future, I think, on the moon is to attach it to something stable rather than trying to do it by hand. That's just an awful lot of physical effort, and it also makes it difficult to retain all the core in the drill stem. So you've never had that problem of keeping core in a drill stem. We had that problem and lost a little bit of core every once in a while.
Yep.
But with that, I think Artemis is trying to utilize the Apollo experience, and God bless them. I think that they'll do very, very well.
Thank you. So speaking of tools, Jeff, you've got something? Would you like to?
I guess I can do it from right here. As we all know, here at GCAGS, HGS,